Good afternoon, guys. Today's discussion A, we are discussing the black box of the suffering mind, a long-form essay on the quiet crisis unfolding inside America's aging population. Okay. The most dangerous place an older adult can end up is not the emergency room, emergency department, not the nursing home, not even the isolation of a rural farmhouse in winter. It is the black box, the sealed interior chamber. The mind retreats into when suffering becomes too heavy to carry, too complex, too articulate. We see it every day in long-term care, primary care, hospice, and family living rooms. We just don't name it. And because we don't name it, we don't treat it. The black box is not a diagnosis. It's a state, a collapse of cognitive bandwidth, a narrowing of emotional range, a shutting down of social permeability. The person can hear you, but cannot reach you. They can see the world, but cannot participate in it. They are present, but inaccessible. In the nation, and in a nation where older adults die by suicide at rates far higher than any other age group. Ignoring this state is not just a clinical oversight, it is a moral failure. The slow drift into the black box. The black box rarely arrives. Suddenly it accumulates. It thickens. It forms a layer by layer as the mind becomes overburdened by demands of late life. Cognitive overload. Older adults live in a world designed for younger brains, faster, digital, noisy, relentlessly demanding. Every appointment, every medication change, every insurance form, every voicemail, every new clinician, every loss, each one is a cognitive tax. Eventually the mind begins to conserve energy by shutting down nonsensical functions. Inside the black box, elders describe, I'm behind glass. My thoughts are stuck. Everything is too much. I can't get to you. These are not metaphors. They are neurological realities. Sensory loss, hearing and vision decline, shrink the accessible world. Conversations become exhausting. Social gatherings become interdisciplinary. Inter in disciplinarable. The the elder treats the elder retreats not because they want to, but because participation requires cognitive effort they no longer have. Medication burden. Polypharmacy burns cognition, fault, flattens effects, and narrows emotional range. The medications meant to stabilize the body often destabilize the mind. Accumulated grief. By late life, grief is not an event. It is a landscape. Spouses, siblings, friends, homes, roles, identities gone. The psyche cannot metabolize endless loss. It shuts down to survive. Identity erosion, retirement, illness, dependency, and institutionalization destabilize selfhood. When identity thins, the world becomes harder to navigate. The black box becomes a refuge. The consequences we refuse to see. The black box is the invisible driver of late life suicide. Disentanglement from care plans. Avoidable hospitalizations. Medication escalation. Caregiver burnout. Worsening dementia trajectories. We treat the symptoms. Missed appointments. Withdrawn behavior. Non-compliance. Flattened effects. But never the underlying state. We respond with more pills, more instructions, more interventions, more complexity. In other words, we make the black box darker. Why this policy why this is a policy failure. Our healthcare system is built for conditions, not states. It recognizes diseases, not overwhelm. It funds procedures, not presence. It measures outcomes, not human bandwidth. We have created a system where the suffering mind is structurally invisible. If we want to prevent late life suicide, reduce caregiving collapse, and restore dignity to aging, we must redesign care around the cognitive realities of older adults. That means relational staff models that prioritize community and human connection, sensory friendly environments that reduce cognitive load, grief competent care pathways that acknowledge the cumulative losses of aging, cognitive load aware communication training for clinicians and caregivers, proactive suicide screening tailored to late life risk patterns, interdisciplinary mental health integration across primary care, geriatrics, and palliative care. This is not soft care, it is structural care. The human cost of doing nothing. Every day, an older adult in America disappears into the black box. They stop answering the phone. They stop going to church. They stop cooking. They stop deciding. They stop hoping. They stop asking for help because asking requires cognitive energy they no longer have. And then, too often, they stop living. We cannot keep pretending this is inevitable. We cannot keep pathologizing what is at its core a failure of our systems to meet the mind where it is. The black box is not the elder's fault, it is ours. The path forward. We, if we name the black box, we can intervene. If we acknowledge cognitive overload as a public health crisis, we can redesign care that reduces it. If we treat suffering as bandwidth problem, not a character flaw, we can reach people before despair comes lethal. The suffering mind is not unreachable. It is simply overwhelmed. Our job as clinicians, policymakers, caregivers, and citizens is to widen the world until the person can step back into it. The black box in the hands of the early behaviorist was never just a metaphor. It was a stance, a posture, almost a kind of scientific humanity, and a mission that what happens inside a person is real, but not directly knowledgeable. Okay, guys, here's the second part of my show today: the black box, a narrative exploration of a foundational idea in behavioral psychology. The early decades, in the early decades of the 20th century, psychology was a young science trying to provide itself or trying to prove itself. Laboratories were filled with levers, bells, cages, and careful notes about what an animal or a human did when the world pressed on it. The behaviorist believed that if psychology was going to be a science, it needed to anchor itself in what could be seen. And so they drew a boundary around the visible. They called it, they called that boundary the black box. A stimulus enters, a response exits. What happens inside is sealed. To Watson and Skinner, the mind was not denied, it was simply placed behind a curtain. They watched a rat press a lever and a child flinch at a loud noise, and they said, "This is what we can measure. This is what we can trust." Thoughts, feelings, interpretations, those lived in the dark interior of the box, inaccessible to the tools of the time. The black box became a kind of scientific discipline. Stimulus, black box. Response: a clean, elegant line, a way of saying, let's study what we can see and leave the rest alone. The black box as a shield against speculation. In a world where psychology had been dominated by introspection, subjective report, the black box was a shield. It protected the field from wandering too far the inevitable. It, ins- it insisted that science must begin with what is observable. It also created a tension because even as behaviorists refused to, to peer inside the box, they knew something was happening there, something powerful, something that shaped the very behaviors they were measuring. They simply chose not to theorize about it. This restraint, this refusal was both the strength and the limitation of behaviorism. The black box, the box in the therapy room. Imagine a therapist in the 1950s. A patient arrives, depressed, withdrawn, unable to get out of bed. The therapist does not ask about childhood memories or unconscious conflicts. Instead, they ask, "What do you what do you do each day? What do you avoid? What reinforces your withdrawal?" The black box is present in the room, but it is silent. The therapist works with what can be seen behavior. This is the origin of behavioral activation, exposure therapy, and the entire lineage of interventions that still anchor modern mental health care. Even today, when cognitive science has opened the box, the behavior tradition remains the backbone of evidence based practice. Opening the box. By the 1960s, the scientific world began to shift. Computers offered metaphors for memory and processing. Neuroscience offered glimpses into the brain's electrical storms. Cognitive psychology stepped forward and said, "We can measure what happens inside, not perfectly, but enough to build models." The black, the black box did not disappear, it simply became transparent. We now study attention, perception, decision making, emotion, regulation, internal processes that behaviorists once bracketed, but the black box metaphor remains a reminder of the discipline that shaped the field. Start with what you can see, build from what you can measure, respect the limits of observation. The box as a human metaphor for clinicians, especially and palliative care. The black box resonates in a different way. You see you see a patient's choices, symptoms, and behaviors. You hear their words, but their internal experience, their fear, their meaning making, their private suffering remains partly opaque, not because it is unimportant, but because it is deeply personal. The black box becomes a symbol of clinical humanity, a reminder that every person carries an interior world that cannot be fully accessed from the outside. Okay, guys, I'll be back on later tonight for the rest of the shows. For now, Gator Wellness, take care, folks.